Welcome, viewers. You are about to hear a captivating and mysterious tale written and narrated by me, Vincent Gray, exclusively for the Detective Chronicles channel. Prepare yourself for a journey through hidden secrets, cunning deception, and a crime more intricate than it first appears. Don't forget to subscribe, so you never miss a thrilling unraveling of the unknown. Vincent Gray, Sherlock Holmes, The Riddle of the Hollow Coin. The fog rolled in thick that morning, as it often did in London, wrapping the city in a damp, impenetrable veil. The sound of the distant clanging of church bells echoed faintly through the mist, a reminder of the hour. Carriages rumbled through the streets, their wheels muffled by the soft, wet cobblestones beneath them, and a lone figure stood in the doorway of a dimly lit street, surveying the quiet world around him. Sherlock Holmes, the renowned detective, was used to the early morning stillness, though today it seemed deeper, almost as if the city itself were holding its breath. The summons had come late the previous evening, a letter slipped under his door with no name attached, only an address, the Manor at the edge of London. And so, Holmes had risen with his usual precision, his mind already working through the possibilities as his sharp eyes inspected every detail of his surroundings. There were few things that escaped his notice, and fewer still that could fool him. Yet, even as the fog clung to the stonework of the streets and curled like a ghost through the alleys, something about this case felt different. It was not the type of case that typically drew his interest, the theft of a mere heirloom, a coin no less. But there was a peculiar weight to it, something hidden just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. Holmes's eyes narrowed as he stepped onto the sidewalk, his long coat billowing behind him, the click of his boots the only sound that cut through the stillness. His mind whirred with questions as he made his way to the manor. The journey was a short one, though the path seemed longer with each step. The estate, nestled in a quiet corner far from the bustle of the city, was an imposing structure, its dark stone walls looming over the surrounding grounds. Vines crawled up its facade, as if attempting to reclaim it from the passing of time. The gates creaked as they swung open, and Holmes entered without hesitation, his eyes scanning the landscape, an old house with secrets of its own. The windows were dark, shuttered as if in mourning, and the air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. Inside, the manor was just as one might expect, opulent yet eerily quiet. The grand entry hall was adorned with portraits of long-dead ancestors, whose eyes seemed to follow Holmes as he moved past them, their painted faces as expressionless as the silent house itself. A faint scent of incense lingered in the air, an attempt to mask the musty odour of age. But Holmes was accustomed to such places, where time's weight pressed heavily upon the walls. He was ushered into a large drawing room, where a fire crackled weakly in the hearth, struggling against the chill that permeated the air. The room was richly appointed, with velvet chairs and draped curtains, yet there was a certain coldness to it. A woman stood by the window, her silhouette framed by the pale light filtering through the glass. Her back was straight, her posture regal, but there was something in her stiff movements that spoke of discomfort. She turned as he entered, her eyes meeting his with an unsettling mixture of resolve and worry. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice soft yet firm, "I trust you found your way here without difficulty?" Holmes studied her carefully. Lady Eleanor, the lady of the house. She was a woman of striking beauty, though her features seemed too perfect, almost unnaturally composed. Her eyes, dark and sharp, held something deeper, an unease that she tried to hide beneath the veneer of grace. Holmes offered a small nod. "Lady Eleanor, I presume?" he asked, his voice smooth, with the quiet confidence of one who never asked a question without already knowing the answer. She gave a nod in return, though her lips tightened slightly. "Yes, Mr. Holmes. I fear that you are the only one who can solve this mystery." Holmes's gaze flicked to the table beside her, where a large, ornate box lay open, revealing a tarnished silver coin nestled within. He approached it without hesitation, his fingers brushing lightly over the cool metal. He could feel the subtle weight of it, the weight of history perhaps. But something else was there too. A disturbance. A faint trace of something he could not yet place. It was not the coin itself, but rather the way it had been left, the manner in which it had been handled. Lady Eleanor watched him closely, her eyes flicking nervously from the coin to Holmes's face. "It is an heirloom," she continued, her voice trembling just slightly. "Passed down through generations. My father, my late husband, they both valued it greatly, but now it is gone. Stolen." "Stolen?" Holmes's voice was clipped, his brow furrowing slightly as he turned to face her. "But here it is, Lady Eleanor, quite clearly in your possession." Her gaze shifted to the coin again, and she took a step back, almost imperceptibly. "That," she said, her tone stiff, "is not the coin that went missing. The one we are searching for, my family's heirloom, has disappeared without a trace." A silence filled the room, thick and suffocating. Holmes stood still, his mind racing through possibilities. A riddle, perhaps. But something deeper lay beneath the surface of this case. Something far more intricate than the simple theft of an heirloom. "I see," Holmes said at last, his voice low, measured. "And when did you first notice the disappearance?" Her eyes met his, and for the briefest moment he saw something flicker there, a shadow of fear. "Last evening," she replied, her voice steady now, but there was no mistaking the nervous edge. "I was preparing to place the coin back in its vault, but when I arrived, it was gone." "And no one else has access to this vault?" Lady Eleanor's lips pressed together, her posture stiffening slightly. "Of course not. It is locked. Only I have the key." Holmes took a slow step closer to her, his gaze never leaving hers. "Is there anyone else who might have access to it? Any servants? Any associates of yours who might have a reason to take the coin?" Her eyes narrowed just slightly. "I trust everyone in my household," she said, her voice cool. "But I fear this matter may be more complicated than you think, Mr. Holmes." Holmes stepped back, his eyes drifting over the room. The fire burned low, casting long shadows across the floor. He could sense the tension in the air, the undercurrent of something not yet spoken. It was there, just out of reach. And as always, he was patient. "I shall need to examine the rest of the manor," he said quietly. "And I will need to speak with your household staff. There is more to this than meets the eye." Lady Eleanor nodded, though there was no mistaking the wariness in her gaze. "Very well," she said, her voice strained. "But I beg of you, Mr. Holmes, find my coin. Find what was taken." Holmes turned to the door, his mind already working through the details, piecing together the fragments of the mystery. Something was amiss, and he would see it solved. But as the door closed behind him, he couldn't shake the feeling that this case would lead him down a path darker than he had anticipated. The early afternoon light streamed through the manor's large windows, casting long beams across the polished wooden floors. The air inside the drawing room felt colder now, the fire having dwindled to little more than glowing embers. Holmes observed the room with quiet precision, noting the luxurious decor, the delicate tapestries on the walls, the polished marble statues that stood like silent sentinels in the corners, and the fine furniture that reflected a life of wealth and privilege. Yet the silence was oppressive, hanging heavy over the room like a shroud, its stillness broken only by the occasional crackling of the fading fire. Lady Eleanor led Holmes toward a set of plush armchairs, gesturing for him to sit. Her movements were deliberate, measured, yet her hands trembled slightly as she folded them in her lap, an involuntary sign of the anxiety she had thus far kept well concealed. Holmes took a seat across from her, allowing his gaze to move past her to the others in the room. Standing by the fireplace, as though seeking the warmth the flames failed to provide, was Thomas Blackwood, the cousin of Lady Eleanor. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with an air of restless energy about him. His brow was furrowed, his lips pressed together in an expression that bordered on impatience. He looked every bit the part of a man used to being in control, yet his posture betrayed an undercurrent of unease. To the side of the room, Dr. William Forsyth stood near the window, his back turned to the others. His thin figure was slightly hunched, as though the weight of his own thoughts bent him inward. Holmes noticed the way his fingers drummed lightly against the windowsill, a subtle but telling sign of agitation. His eyes, when they met Holmes's, were cautious, guarded even. There was a restlessness to him, an unsettling edge to his demeanour that Holmes immediately found intriguing. Lady Eleanor glanced between them all before speaking, her voice as composed as ever. "Mr. Holmes, I've asked that you meet Thomas and Dr. Forsyth. They are, for all intents and purposes, the ones who knew the coin best. They may hold some insight into its disappearance." Holmes inclined his head, his gaze moving briefly to each of the men in turn, before he spoke. "I trust you have not been troubled by this matter too long, then." His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a sharpness that invited no room for dissembling. Thomas Blackwood chuckled, though it was a strained sound, more a bark than a laugh. "Not too long, no," he said, his voice thick with a particular indifference. "But I'll admit, it's a bit of a bother, all this. An heirloom coin, hardly worth all this fuss, don't you think?" His eyes flicked to Lady Eleanor, and for a brief moment Holmes caught the faintest flash of something, resentment perhaps, though it was quickly masked by a half-hearted smile. "Some things are worth more than others," Holmes replied, his tone measured. But there was an unspoken challenge in his words, an implication that the value of the coin might not lie in what one could see on the surface. He allowed the silence to linger for a moment before addressing Blackwood directly. "I gather that you have no particular attachment to this coin, Mr. Blackwood." Blackwood's lips twisted slightly, a smirk that failed to reach his eyes. "No more than the next man," he said, his gaze flicking over Holmes with an appraising, almost dismissive look. "I've always thought that these old things, coins, relics, antiques, are a bit of a nuisance, more trouble than they're worth. But as I said, this isn't really my concern." Holmes studied him for a moment longer, his eyes narrowing just so, before turning his attention to Dr. Forsyth. The physician's shoulders were slightly hunched, as though the weight of the conversation, or perhaps something else, was pressing down on him. "And you, Dr. Forsyth?" Holmes asked, his voice cool but probing. "What can you tell me about the coin?" The doctor paused, then slowly turned to face Holmes, his movements deliberate but stiff. "Not much more than what Lady Eleanor has already said, I'm afraid," he said softly. His voice was calm, almost too calm, and his eyes seemed to avoid meeting Holmes's directly. "I've known the coin for some time. It's a family heirloom, of great significance, I believe. But beyond that, I've no particular insight into its disappearance." Holmes's gaze lingered on Forsyth, noting the faintest tremor in his hands. The doctor's words, though polite and measured, lacked conviction. There was something else at play here, something he wasn't saying. "Of course," Holmes murmured. "But you were aware of its significance, were you not? Perhaps you too have observed something unusual in the days leading up to its disappearance." Forsyth's eyes flicked briefly to Lady Eleanor, then back to Holmes. He stiffened, and for the first time a shadow passed over his face, his normally controlled expression slipping ever so slightly. "No, nothing unusual. At least, nothing that could explain this." His voice trailed off, and he glanced toward the door, his posture growing more rigid. Holmes felt the subtle shift in the room, the tension building between the three of them. Lady Eleanor's hands tightened in her lap, a flicker of unease crossing her features. Blackwood shifted from one foot to the other, clearly impatient with the line of questioning. Holmes stood slowly, his long fingers tracing the edge of the table where the tarnished coin had been placed earlier. He felt its cold surface again, pressing gently against the back of his hand as he turned toward Lady Eleanor. "I must ask to see the vault where this coin was kept," he said, his voice firm, yet laced with an undeniable sense of finality. "If I am to proceed, I must have a complete understanding of its last known movements." Lady Eleanor's gaze hardened for the briefest moment, though she quickly regained her composure. "Of course, Mr. Holmes," she replied evenly, standing up with grace. "Follow me." As they moved toward the door, Holmes felt the weight of the eyes on him. Blackwood's expression remained unreadable, but Dr. Forsyth's eyes followed him closely, as though searching for something he couldn't quite name. Holmes allowed the tension to thicken, his mind already turning over the subtle clues he had gathered from their brief exchange. Each person, he knew, was hiding something, and it was only a matter of time before he would uncover what that was. The vault was nestled at the heart of the manor, hidden behind an ornate door framed with ivy-patterned carvings, its surface worn with age but still imposing in its quiet authority. The atmosphere grew noticeably colder as Holmes approached, the faint scent of dust and old wood filling the air. The room seemed to exude a silence all its own, a heavy stillness that pressed against the walls and lingered in the corners, where shadows seemed to grow deeper, as if unwilling to reveal their secrets. Holmes's footsteps echoed faintly as he entered the small, yet meticulously designed chamber. Lady Eleanor had moved ahead of him, her steps sure despite the apprehension in her eyes. She stood by the door, her back straight, though her hands gripped the handle with a tension that was almost palpable. She glanced over her shoulder at Holmes before turning the key in the lock with a sharp click, the sound resonating throughout the quiet space. As the heavy door swung open, the scent of aged leather and parchment filled the room. Shelves lined the walls, each carefully arranged with stacks of ledgers, scrolls, and various relics of the past. At the far end of the room stood a large wooden chest, its surface worn smooth by the passage of countless years. Yet it was the chest that commanded attention, for within it rested the missing heirloom, the coin. Holmes's gaze immediately fixed on the chest, but something about the scene didn't sit right with him. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and sticky, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Lady Eleanor stepped forward, her hand trembling as she reached for the coin. But when she lifted it from its resting place, Holmes's sharp eyes noticed something alarming. The coin was not as it should be. The surface, which had once gleamed with the polish of centuries, was now marred with streaks of tarnish, dull and dark, as though it had been handled carelessly. "It's gone," Lady Eleanor whispered, her voice a fragile thread in the otherwise silent room. Holmes's brow furrowed, his sharp gaze not leaving the coin in her hand. There was something strange about the way it had been handled, the way it felt in her grip. And as his eyes travelled to the rest of the room, he noticed another disturbing detail. The vault had been disturbed, its contents scattered carelessly, the careful order that should have existed among the artifacts broken. The once pristine shelves now bore signs of haste and disarray, with old papers lying discarded on the floor, their edges curling with age. "Is this how you left it, Lady Eleanor?" Holmes asked, his voice cool and controlled, though beneath it there was an undeniable current of unease. He was already piecing the scene together, his mind working swiftly. Lady Eleanor's face paled, the colour draining from her features. I did not touch the shelves," she replied, her voice trembling, her gaze moving toward the scattered papers. "I only came in to replace the coin after our dinner. But when I arrived this morning, the vault was open, and the coin was gone." Holmes reached out and took the coin from her hand, turning it over carefully. His fingers traced the tarnished surface, feeling the roughness of its edges, the hollowness at its centre. Something was hidden inside the coin, a hidden compartment perhaps, though it was clear that this was no ordinary heirloom. "The coin has been tampered with," he murmured, his voice low, almost to himself. He turned his eyes toward Lady Eleanor, a question in them that she did not wish to answer. "Did you see anyone enter the vault last night, or perhaps after you left it?" Lady Eleanor bit her lip, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "No one," she whispered, though her eyes darted nervously toward the open vault. "But I cannot say I was the only one who knew of its location. My cousin Thomas was here last night." Holmes's gaze snapped to her. Thomas Blackwood. Lady Eleanor nodded, her expression one of deep uncertainty. Yes. He came to discuss something with me, though I did not think it was of any importance. Holmes stood still, considering her words. His gaze flicked back to the open vault, then to the scattered papers. Something was wrong here. Something more than just a theft. The vault had not been simply opened. It had been rifled through in a hurried, almost frantic manner. And if Thomas had known of the coin's location... Holmes felt a sudden shift in the atmosphere, a ripple of tension that ran through the room. He turned to the open door, where the figure of Dr. Forsyth now stood, framed in the dim light of the hallway. His thin face was drawn tight with concern, and his eyes darted toward the open vault before returning to Holmes. "Has something happened?" Forsyth asked, his voice strained, almost too soft. Holmes studied the doctor for a moment, noting the slight tremor in his hand as he gripped the doorframe. "It seems," Holmes began, his voice steady, though the words held an unspoken weight, "that the coin has been stolen, though not in the way one might expect." Lady Eleanor turned to Forsyth, her face pale. "But it was in the vault when I left last night. How could anyone have taken it without my knowing?" Forsyth's gaze moved slowly from Lady Eleanor to the coin in Holmes's hand. His lips pressed together as if contemplating something unsaid. I don't know, Lady Eleanor. But someone must have known of its significance. And perhaps someone saw fit to act before it was too late." Holmes raised an eyebrow at Forsyth's words, his eyes narrowing slightly. The doctor's response had been vague, evasive even, though the words themselves seemed laden with an undercurrent of fear. "Indeed," Holmes replied, his voice soft but firm. "Which is why I must ask you all again, who knew about the coin's location and who would stand to benefit from its disappearance?" Before either Lady Eleanor or Dr. Forsyth could respond, the distant sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. A figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim light of the corridor. It was Thomas Blackwood, his tall frame filling the doorway. His eyes swept over the room quickly, assessing the situation, before his gaze finally landed on Holmes. "I thought I heard voices," Thomas said, his tone casual, though there was a sharpness to it that suggested otherwise. He stepped into the room with deliberate slowness, his boots clicking softly on the floor. "What's all this about? Is it true? Has something happened to the coin?" Holmes turned to face him, his gaze unwavering. "It seems the coin has gone missing, Mr. Blackwood," he said, his voice carrying a hint of challenge. "And the circumstances surrounding its disappearance are unusual, to say the least." Thomas's lips twitched, but his eyes were cool, guarded. "Unusual? How so? I assure you I've no interest in the coin. It's just a trinket after all." Holmes didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned his attention back to the disarray of the vault, his mind already piecing together the fragments of the puzzle. There was more to this than a simple theft. A riddle, perhaps. One that would require far more than just logic to solve. The room was heavy with silence as Holmes carefully examined the scattered papers and the open vault, his sharp eyes scanning the chaos that lay before him. The disarray of the chamber, papers scattered across the floor, a fallen ledger beside the vault, spoke volumes. There was nothing casual about this. Someone had been looking for something. But what? And why? Holmes stepped carefully around the room, his shoes making no more than the faintest whisper against the polished wooden floors. His gaze was drawn to the edge of a torn letter, its edges frayed and burned, as if it had been hastily discarded. His fingers hovered above it for a moment before he carefully picked it up, his eyes narrowing as he took in the partially legible script. The ink was smudged, the paper browned with age, yet it was clear enough that Holmes could make out a few key words. Dr. Malkovich, inheritance, concealed. Holmes muttered under his breath, his brow furrowing. The letter, though incomplete, held the promise of a crucial connection, one he knew he would have to explore further. The mention of Dr. Malkovich piqued his curiosity. Who was this person, and how did they factor into the mystery of the missing coin? He folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his pocket before turning his attention back to Lady Eleanor. She stood by the door, her expression taut with a mixture of anxiety and confusion. Her eyes flicked from Holmes to the vault, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I can't understand it, Mr. Holmes," Lady Eleanor said, her voice shaking ever so slightly. "I don't know why anyone would do this. The coin, my family's coin, has been in the vault for generations. It was secure. No one but me had access to it." Holmes nodded, his eyes narrowing as he studied her face. He had learned to read the smallest gestures, the micro-expressions that often revealed far more than words ever could. And in that moment, he saw it, just the faintest flicker of doubt in Lady Eleanor's gaze, a hesitation that spoke volumes. Was it fear? Or was it something else? "Are you certain, Lady Eleanor, that no one else knew about the coin's exact location?" Holmes asked, his tone gentle but pressing. "You mentioned your cousin, Mr. Blackwood. Is there anyone else, perhaps a servant or another acquaintance who may have known?" Her lips pressed together, and Holmes saw the briefest tension in her shoulders before she answered. "Number, I trust everyone in my household. And Thomas would never—" "You cannot be certain of that," Holmes interrupted quietly, his eyes locked on hers. He gave her a moment before speaking again. "Mr. Blackwood is, as I understand it, a man of some wealth and ambition. It would not be beyond reason for him to have knowledge of such things." Lady Eleanor's face flushed, and she looked away from Holmes, her gaze falling to the floor. The tension between them was palpable now, her unease growing as Holmes's words seemed to hit closer to the mark than she had anticipated. He could see it clearly now, the struggle within her, the internal conflict she had been trying to suppress. But it wasn't just fear of the coin's loss. There was more. "Of course," Holmes continued, his voice softening, "it's important to consider all possibilities. But the question remains, why would anyone go to such lengths to steal something so seemingly insignificant, unless they were after something more?" Lady Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway, drawing Holmes's attention. Dr. Forsyth appeared in the doorway, his thin figure framed by the dim light of the corridor. His eyes were wide, his expression unreadable, though his hands were pressed firmly against the edge of the doorframe as if he were holding himself steady. Holmes regarded him quietly for a moment, before nodding toward the open vault. "Dr. Forsyth, I trust you've had a chance to examine the contents of the vault?" Forsyth's gaze flicked over the room briefly before he nodded, his lips pressed together in a thin line. "I have. But I'm afraid I don't see how this can be explained. As Lady Eleanor said, no one but her had the key to the vault. There is no way anyone could have entered without her knowledge." Holmes's eyes shifted to Forsyth's hands, which, though steady, were noticeably tense, the fingertips pressed against the wood of the doorframe, as though seeking balance. The doctor was clearly nervous, and Holmes couldn't help but wonder why. "And yet, here we are," Holmes said, his voice soft, almost to himself. "The vault is open, and the coin is gone, a mystery that defies reason, or so it would seem." Lady Eleanor frowned, glancing between Holmes and Forsyth. "But Dr. Forsyth is right. No one had access to it. I just don't understand how this could have happened." Holmes turned back to the vault, his sharp eyes scanning the room again, lingering on the torn papers and the scattered ledgers. Something about the scene didn't add up. It wasn't just a simple theft. The vault had been disturbed, rifled through, as if someone had been searching for something, not simply the coin itself. And the letter he had found, the one with the faint traces of ink that spoke of concealment, only deepened the mystery. There was more to this coin than anyone had realized. His gaze drifted across the room, and as he moved toward the far corner, his eyes fell on a small desk tucked against the wall. There, half hidden beneath a stack of old letters, was a small leather-bound book. It was thin, almost inconspicuous, but something about it caught his attention. He moved toward it, his fingers brushing against the worn surface as he carefully lifted it from the desk. It was a ledger, and from the careful handwriting inside, it appeared to be a record of various transactions, perhaps even family accounts. Holmes's eyes flicked over the pages quickly, his mind working furiously to make connections. One name, repeated several times, stood out to him: Dr. Malkovich, the very same name mentioned in the letter. A connection. Holmes's pulse quickened ever so slightly, and his mind began to unravel the threads of a much larger web. "Well, well," Holmes murmured, his voice low but filled with certainty. "It seems we are not dealing with a simple matter of theft after all." He turned back to Lady Eleanor and Doctor Forsyth, his expression now one of focused determination. The coin, it appears, was never truly the target. The question we must now answer is, what was? The corridors of the manor felt colder as Holmes moved from room to room, his mind piecing together the fragments of the puzzle with careful precision. The ledger had revealed much, and yet there was more, so much more, that remained hidden. The name of Dr. Malkovich had appeared too many times to ignore. What was the connection between this figure and the coin? Why had it been concealed, and who stood to gain from its theft? These questions lingered in the back of Holmes's mind as he made his way toward the drawing room where the interviews would begin. Lady Eleanor sat in her usual place, her posture stiff and composed, though the air around her buzzed with unease. Her face, though pale, was a mask of calm, a mask that cracked only momentarily when her eyes met Holmes's. She had been quiet since his discovery of the ledger, but Holmes could see the turmoil brewing beneath the surface. Her hands clenched tightly in her lap, and her eyes darted toward the door, as though expecting someone, or something, to appear. "Lady Eleanor," Holmes said, his voice measured, "I would like to ask you a few more questions, if I may." She nodded stiffly, though her lips pressed together, as though bracing for something she had hoped to avoid. "Of course, Mr. Holmes," she replied, her voice betraying no hint of the anxiety that clearly gripped her. "What would you like to know?" Holmes studied her for a moment before speaking, his eyes sharp with intent. "You mentioned that no one had access to the vault. Yet, we have evidence to suggest otherwise. You also mentioned your cousin, Mr. Blackwood. Can you tell me more about his movements in the hours leading up to the discovery of the theft?" Lady Eleanor shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her gaze dropping to the floor. Thomas came to see me last night," she said quietly. "He said he wanted to speak to me about personal matters. I didn't think much of it at the time." "Did he seem agitated? Or perhaps overly interested in the coin?" Holmes pressed, his voice steady as he watched her closely. Lady Eleanor hesitated, her lips parting as if to speak, then closing again. She opened her mouth once more before answering, her words slower this time, as though carefully weighed. "He was impatient, but not unusually so. He's always been that way. Thomas doesn't have the same appreciation for our family's history. I thought it was nothing more than his usual attitude. He doesn't care much for heirlooms." Holmes nodded slowly, considering her words. Something in Lady Eleanor's tone had shifted, a faint undercurrent of something deeper, a tension that hadn't been there before. It was clear that Thomas Blackwood was a significant figure in this case, though whether he was involved directly or merely a witness to something darker, Holmes could not yet say. Just as he was about to continue, a shadow fell across the doorframe, and the figure of Thomas Blackwood himself appeared in the doorway. His broad frame filled the entrance, and for a brief moment the light seemed to fade slightly, casting him in a darker hue. He stood there for a moment, his sharp eyes scanning the room before he spoke, his voice smooth, yet carrying an unmistakable edge. "I trust I'm not interrupting," Blackwood said, stepping into the room without waiting for a response. Holmes regarded him coolly, taking in the confident, almost arrogant stance with which Blackwood held himself. There was no hesitation in his movements, no discomfort, only a sense of calculated self-assurance. His eyes flicked briefly to Lady Eleanor before settling on Holmes. Not at all, Holmes replied, his tone calm but laced with an underlying tension. We were just discussing your visit last night. Blackwood raised an eyebrow, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. My visit, you say? I'm afraid I don't remember much of it, Mr. Holmes. I simply came to speak with my cousin about matters of family. Nothing more. Indeed, Holmes replied, his gaze unwavering. But I must ask, did you at any point during your visit have any interest in the vault? Perhaps inquire about the location of the coin? Blackwood's eyes flickered with just the faintest spark of irritation. The vault? He repeated, his tone dismissive. Hardly, Mr. Holmes. It's just an old relic. I don't see the point in bothering with such things. You've been talking to Lady Eleanor about it, haven't you? She's the one who keeps that nonsense locked away. Holmes studied him intently, noting the subtle shift in Blackwood's posture. He was trying to hide it, but there was a nervousness there, just beneath the surface. Something had unsettled him, and Holmes was certain it had to do with the coin. You seem particularly unconcerned with the coin's disappearance, Holmes remarked, his voice quiet but sharp. Yet you've been so eager to dismiss it. Why? Blackwood's smile faltered, and for the first time, Holmes saw a flicker of discomfort in his eyes. But he quickly recovered, his smirk returning as he leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. Because, Mr. Holmes, it's just a coin, not worth any more time than it's already taken. Holmes nodded, his eyes never leaving Blackwood's. You may be right, but sometimes it's not the coin itself that's of value. Sometimes it's what the coin represents, and what it conceals. The words hung in the air, charged with meaning, and for a brief moment, a palpable tension filled the room. Blackwood's lips pressed into a thin line, and his jaw tightened ever so slightly. At that moment, the door opened once more, and Dr. Forsyth entered the room, his face ashen and drawn, his eyes flicking nervously between the three of them. His hands were clasped tightly together, his knuckles white against the dark fabric of his sleeves. Forsyth began, his voice shaky, but he was interrupted by Blackwood's quick, cutting remark. Has the coin been found, then? Blackwood asked sharply, his gaze fixed on Holmes. His voice held a thread of tension now, the self-assuredness cracking, revealing a deeper concern. Holmes remained silent for a moment, his eyes studying Forsyth closely. The doctor's presence in the room was an unexpected development, and Holmes felt the weight of his nervous energy. He had been observing them all for hours now, and there was something about Forsyth, something Holmes could not yet put his finger on, that seemed crucial. No, Mr. Blackwood, Holmes replied, his tone calm. The coin has not been found, but we have learned a great deal. There are still many pieces to this puzzle, and it seems that each one of you may hold a key. The air had grown heavier with each passing hour, the weight of unspoken truths thickening between the four individuals gathered in the drawing room. Holmes had long since abandoned the notion that he would find easy answers in this house. Every word spoken seemed to add another layer of complexity to the mystery, each interaction a delicate dance of contradictions and half-truths. Yet as he watched the others, their fidgeting, their subtle glances, and their carefully constructed responses, Holmes knew that the truth was hidden beneath their words, buried beneath the surface of their carefully maintained facades. The room itself felt smaller now, the shadows of the setting sun creeping across the floor as the light outside dimmed. The fire had long since died down to embers, leaving only the smell of wood smoke hanging in the air. Holmes could hear the faint ticking of an antique clock on the mantel, its rhythmic sound adding to the mounting tension. His mind was sharp, but the growing sense of unease gnawed at him. Something crucial was being concealed. He turned to Doctor Forsyth first, whose pale face had become even paler since his arrival. The doctor's earlier nervousness had not abated, and now, as he stood in front of Holmes, his fingers twitched in an almost imperceptible manner. Holmes observed the physician closely, noting the subtle signs of anxiety that the doctor had been careful to hide earlier. The eyes, the slight tremor in his hands, and the careful distance he maintained from the others spoke of a man under strain. But what had caused that strain? "Dr. Forsyth," Holmes said, his voice calm but insistent. "Earlier, you mentioned that you knew little about the coin's disappearance. But I must ask, how is it that you are so familiar with the contents of this vault if you were not involved in the coin's handling?" Forsyth flinched, his gaze flickering toward Lady Eleanor for a brief moment, as though seeking reassurance. I don't know what you mean, Mr. Holmes," the doctor stammered, his voice tight. "I have no more knowledge of it than Lady Eleanor has provided. I have no interest in the coin." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "Is that so?" He leaned forward, his gaze never leaving Forsyth's. "And yet, I've found references to your name alongside that of Dr. Malkovich in various documents I've uncovered. Documents that imply a deeper involvement in certain affairs, shall we say, of a confidential nature." Forsyth stiffened, his lips pressing tightly together. The tension in the room escalated, and for a moment Holmes thought he might push the doctor further, but then he noticed the change in Forsyth's demeanour. The nervous energy had been replaced by something else, something darker. Forsyth started, his voice shaking before he stopped, glancing toward Lady Eleanor once more. "There are things, Mr. Holmes, things that cannot be explained. I cannot tell you everything. Some things must remain hidden." Holmes allowed the silence to stretch, watching as Forsyth shifted uncomfortably. He could see the doctor struggling internally, his mind wrestling with the decision to reveal more, or to retreat further into his carefully constructed web of silence. The man was hiding something, but it wasn't just about the coin. It was clear now that there were connections here that reached far beyond the family heirloom. Turning away from Forsyth, Holmes let his gaze fall upon Lady Eleanor. She was no longer sitting with the poised elegance she had once displayed. Instead, she was leaning forward slightly, her eyes locked on Holmes's with an intensity that betrayed her inner turmoil. Her lips were pressed tight, and her fingers drummed anxiously against the arm of the chair. "Lady Eleanor," Holmes began, his voice soft but carrying the weight of unspoken accusation. "You've spoken often about your trust in your household staff. But I must ask, have you been entirely open with me about your knowledge of the people involved in this household? Is there no one, perhaps, who might have had access to the vault and yet remains unnoticed in this investigation?" Lady Eleanor's breath caught in her throat at his question, and for a moment she seemed at a loss for words. The mask she had worn so carefully began to crack, her composure faltering in the wake of his words. I don't understand what you mean," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Everyone who has access to the vault is known to me. I trust them. Holmes didn't allow her to finish. "You trust them, yes. But is that trust entirely without question? Have you never once had a reason to doubt the loyalty of those around you?" The question seemed to hit its mark. Lady Eleanor's eyes darted nervously toward the door, then back to Holmes, and in that fleeting moment, Holmes saw it, the briefest flicker of fear. It was gone as quickly as it had appeared, but it was enough. "You suspect someone?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You think someone in my household could have taken the coin?" Holmes's gaze softened, though his words remained pointed. "I suspect that someone in this house knows far more than they've let on, and I suspect, Lady Eleanor, that you know more than you're willing to admit." Lady Eleanor stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, her hand gripping the back of it tightly. "You accuse me of hiding something, Mr. Holmes?" Her voice was sharp now, and for the first time, the anger that had been simmering beneath the surface came to the fore. "I have nothing to hide. I've been honest with you. This coin means nothing to me, but it is my family's legacy. Holmes raised his hand to silence her, his expression calm but unyielding. "Lady Eleanor, I have never accused you of anything. But the truth is that something does not add up. The story you've told me about your cousin, Mr. Blackwood, and the vault's security does not match the evidence I've uncovered." She froze at his words, her hand still clutching the back of the chair. Her expression faltered, and Holmes could see the gears of her mind turning as she processed the weight of his statement. There was a pause, and then her voice came again, softer, yet edged with uncertainty. You don't believe me, do you?" she whispered. Holmes's gaze softened, but his response was firm. "I believe that you are hiding something, Lady Eleanor. But what? I cannot say yet." Lady Eleanor took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she released her grip on the chair. Perhaps I have not been entirely truthful with you, Mr. Holmes," she admitted quietly. "There are things in my past that I've tried to bury, things that you might uncover." Holmes said nothing, only watching her intently. There was a change in the air now, a shift in the dynamics of the room. The walls had come down, just a fraction, and what Lady Eleanor revealed next could very well be the key to unravelling the entire mystery. The manor seemed stiller now, quieter, as if holding its breath. Holmes stood in the dimly lit drawing room, his mind working at a rapid pace, piecing together the jigsaw of information that had been presented to him. The pieces were scattered, disjointed, but they were starting to form a clearer picture. Lady Eleanor's admission had given him something tangible to grasp onto, a thread to pull, and he could feel the weight of it, heavy in the silence. He turned away from the others, his gaze drifting to the fireplace, where only the last embers flickered, casting faint shadows that danced along the walls. The ticking of the clock on the mantel had become the loudest sound in the room, its rhythmic pulse an anchor in the growing tension. Holmes breathed in deeply, allowing the quiet to settle around him as he began to run through the details once more. Lady Eleanor had finally acknowledged the truth, the possibility that there were secrets buried deeper than the coin itself. But what secrets? And why had she chosen to hide them now, when the case seemed to be unravelling before her eyes? Holmes's thoughts turned to the ledger he had found earlier, the one that had so clearly linked Dr. Forsyth with Dr. Malkovich. The presence of that name, so unexpectedly intertwined with the mystery, had set off a chain reaction in Holmes's mind. He was certain now that the coin, though important, was not the primary objective. No, the coin was a diversion, a symbol, perhaps even a key, but it was not the true target. The true target was something far more valuable, something hidden beneath layers of time and deceit. He turned back to Lady Eleanor, who was now standing by the window, her profile silhouetted against the fading light. Her earlier anger had subsided, replaced with an air of resignation, a quiet acceptance that the secrets she had long kept were about to be brought to light. The fear in her eyes had not disappeared, but it had been tempered with something else. Guilt, perhaps, or the weight of a confession that could no longer remain unspoken. "Lady Eleanor," Holmes said quietly, his voice cutting through the stillness of the room. "There is more to this than simply the coin, isn't there? You've kept something hidden from me, something far more valuable perhaps than the coin itself." She didn't answer immediately, but Holmes could see the subtle way she flinched, the tightening of her shoulders, the brief closing of her eyes as if bracing herself against the weight of his words. Slowly, she turned to face him, her expression unreadable, though there was a flicker of something deeper there. Fear, yes, but also a glimmer of understanding. She knew that Holmes had pieced it together. She could not hide forever. I didn't want to drag my family's name through the mud," she began, her voice soft but steady. "But now, I see no way out." Holmes took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "The ledger, Lady Eleanor. The name Dr. Malkovich appears too often to be a coincidence. He's connected to your family in some way, isn't he? I've seen the evidence. The coin wasn't the only thing being concealed." Lady Eleanor's face grew pale again, and she took a deep breath before speaking. "Dr. Malkovich was my father's close friend. No, more than that. They were business partners, involved in shady dealings. My father had debts, many of them, and Dr. Malkovich was always there to offer assistance. He was more than a doctor. He was a financier, a man who knew how to manipulate people, how to control them. Holmes's brow furrowed as he processed her words. And the coin? What part did it play in all this? Lady Eleanor lowered her gaze, her fingers twisting together nervously. The coin was a safeguard, a symbol of my father's debt to Malkovich. It wasn't merely an heirloom, as I had led you to believe. It was a form of collateral, a guarantee that Malkovich would have control over my family should my father ever fail to repay him. Holmes's mind raced as he pieced this new information together. The coin was not just a family heirloom, not just a symbol of their lineage. It was a symbol of a debt that had been passed down through the generations. Malkovich's influence, his hold over Lady Eleanor's family, had been kept in check by the coin. But now, with her father's death and her inability to manage the affairs of the estate, the control had shifted. Malkovich had come back for what was owed to him, and the coin had been the key to unlocking that power. "And your cousin, Mr. Blackwood?" Holmes asked, his voice calm, though his mind was already jumping ahead, connecting the dots. "What role does he play in all of this?" Lady Eleanor's face tightened, and for the first time, Holmes saw a flicker of genuine fear in her eyes. Thomas knew of the coin. He knew its value. He's been trying to find it for years, ever since my father's death. He wanted to use it to leverage Malkovich's power, to gain control over the estate. I didn't realize just how much he'd been influenced by Malkovich's promises. Holmes paused for a moment, absorbing the weight of her confession. So Mr. Blackwood was aware of the coin's significance. But how does Dr. Forsyth fit into this? Lady Eleanor's eyes widened, her hands clutching the edges of the chair for support. Dr. Forsyth. He was part of the scheme. He was involved with Malkovich too. I didn't know the full extent of their relationship, but I knew they were working together. It was Malkovich's plan, all along. Forsyth was meant to help keep the family's secrets hidden, to ensure that the debts would never surface. Holmes took a step back, his mind now fully understanding the complexity of the situation. The coin, the ledger, the ties to Malkovich, it all made sense now. The theft of the coin wasn't about the coin itself. It was about power, control, and a web of debts that had been spun too tightly for anyone to escape. "This goes far deeper than I anticipated," Holmes murmured, almost to himself. The coin was a key to something far more dangerous than I could have imagined. Lady Eleanor nodded slowly, her face pale and strained, as though the weight of her family's secrets had finally become too much to bear. Holmes turned away from her, his mind already working through the implications of her confession. "You've given me much to consider, Lady Eleanor. The truth is clearer now, but the path to unearthing it will be difficult. There are still pieces to this puzzle that need to be put into place." The atmosphere in the drawing room had shifted, thick with the weight of revelations and unspoken truths. Holmes, who had been pacing slowly across the room, stopped in his tracks. His mind had drawn all the threads together: the tarnished coin, the cryptic letter, the whispers of debts hidden behind doors long closed. The time for conjecture had passed. The answers were now within reach, and all that remained was the dramatic unmasking of the truth. Lady Eleanor sat in silence, her face pale but resolute, though the faintest tremor in her hands betrayed the unease that still gripped her. Her eyes flicked toward the door, as though expecting someone, or something, to enter at any moment. The weight of her family's secrets hung heavy in the air, and she seemed to sense that the moment of truth was approaching. Holmes glanced at the clock on the mantel, noting the slow passage of time. The sun had long set, and the last vestiges of daylight faded into the shadows of the manor. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls themselves were closing in, the mystery becoming more suffocating with each passing second. Footsteps echoed down the corridor outside the drawing room, their cadence deliberate and unmistakable. Holmes's eyes flicked toward the door as it creaked open, and there, standing in the doorway, was Thomas Blackwood. His tall frame filled the space, casting a long shadow across the room. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, betrayed nothing. His posture was rigid, almost too composed, as if he were prepared for whatever confrontation was about to unfold. "You were expecting me, I take it?" Blackwood's voice was smooth, with a hint of mockery, though there was an underlying tension that could not be concealed. He stepped into the room, his gaze immediately locking onto Holmes. "I was," Holmes replied, his tone calm but carrying an undeniable weight. He allowed the silence to linger for a moment before continuing. "I trust you're aware that I've been piecing together the truth of your involvement, Mr. Blackwood." The faintest twitch in Blackwood's jaw betrayed the sudden shift in his demeanour. He stopped in the middle of the room, his eyes flicking between Holmes, Lady Eleanor, and the others, before speaking again. "I don't know what game you're playing, Holmes, but I assure you, I've had enough of this. My family's affairs are none of your business." Holmes took a slow step forward, his eyes narrowing, his voice steady but firm. "I think you'll find that your family's affairs are my business now, Mr. Blackwood. You've been playing a dangerous game, one that has led you to manipulate your cousin, Lady Eleanor, into hiding the truth, all in pursuit of something far more valuable than a mere coin." Lady Eleanor's breath caught in her throat at his words, and she glanced at Blackwood with an expression of disbelief. "Thomas, you—" She stopped herself, her voice shaking with the realization of the full extent of his deception. Blackwood's expression faltered for just a moment, a flicker of something, fear, perhaps, passing through his eyes before he regained his composure. His lips curled into a tight smile, but the tension in his posture told a different story. "You've got it all wrong, Holmes," Blackwood said, his voice cold, but there was an edge to it now, a thin veneer of control that barely masked his growing agitation. "I've done what I had to do. You think I'm the villain here? You think it's all so simple, don't you?" Holmes stepped closer, his sharp gaze never leaving Blackwood. "I think you've played a dangerous game, one that has caught you in a web of your own making. The coin, as you know, was never just a family heirloom. It was collateral, a symbol of the debt your family owes to Dr. Malkovich. And you, Mr. Blackwood, were willing to go to any lengths to claim what was rightfully, though wrongly, yours." The room grew heavy with the weight of Holmes's words, and Blackwood's face darkened. He took a step toward Holmes, his hands balled into fists at his sides, the tension in his frame evident. "Don't lecture me about debts, Holmes," Blackwood spat, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't know anything about the sacrifices I've made. You don't know what it's like to be controlled, to be shackled by a past you didn't create. I had to do what was necessary." Holmes stood his ground, his expression unwavering. "And that, Mr. Blackwood, is where you made your fatal mistake. You assumed you could control everything. Lady Eleanor, the coin, even Malkovich himself. But you underestimated something crucial: the lengths to which a person will go when they've been cornered." Lady Eleanor's eyes widened as the full scope of the situation began to sink in. She looked between Holmes and Blackwood, her heart racing. "Thomas, what have you done?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Blackwood's lips tightened, and for a moment there was a flash of something in his eyes, something almost unrecognizable. "I did what I had to do," he repeated, but his words now held less conviction. The armor he had so carefully crafted seemed to crack, revealing the vulnerability beneath. Malkovich wasn't interested in the coin, not really. He wanted control, over the estate, over me. But the coin was the key to everything. Holmes nodded slowly, his mind piecing together the final pieces. "You tried to leverage Malkovich's influence, to use the coin to secure your position. But you didn't count on Dr. Forsyth's involvement, did you?" Blackwood's face turned pale, and for the first time, Holmes saw fear in his eyes. "Forsyth," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "He was supposed to be on my side, but he betrayed me. He was in league with Malkovich from the beginning." The revelation hung in the air, thick and heavy, and for a long moment no one spoke. Blackwood stood frozen in place, his shoulders slumped as the truth finally came crashing down around him. The power he had so desperately sought was slipping through his fingers, and in that moment, Holmes knew the game had come to its end. Lady Eleanor took a deep, shuddering breath, her hands still trembling. "Thomas, why didn't you come to me? Why didn't you tell me the truth?" she asked, her voice breaking. Blackwood's eyes softened for a moment, but the hardness returned quickly. "Because I knew you'd stop me. You'd never have let me do what was necessary." His voice was tight with frustration, but there was a sadness there too, a resignation that came from realizing the futility of his actions. Holmes stood in silence for a moment, allowing the weight of Blackwood's admission to settle. He had uncovered the truth, but it had come at a price. The destruction of a family, the shattering of bonds that could never be repaired. "Thomas Blackwood," Holmes said, his voice calm but final, "you've played your part, but this ends now. The coin will be returned to its rightful place, and the debts your family has accrued will be settled, whether you like it or not." Blackwood stared at him for a moment, as if weighing his options, before turning sharply toward the door. His footsteps echoed down the hallway, fading into the distance, leaving the room in a stillness that seemed almost too quiet to bear. Holmes let out a slow breath, his eyes lingering on the space where Blackwood had stood. The truth had been revealed, but it had come at a cost. The air was heavy with the aftermath of the confrontation, and Holmes knew that the pieces of this puzzle had finally fallen into place. Lady Eleanor stood by the window, her back to him now, her eyes distant. "What happens now, Mr. Holmes?" she asked, her voice soft, almost resigned. Holmes turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Now," he said quietly, "you begin the long process of rebuilding what has been broken." The mansion was eerily quiet now, the silence in the air thick and still. Holmes stood in the drawing room, his gaze sweeping over the surroundings, the scene of a mystery now solved. Lady Eleanor sat by the window, her face turned toward the night, the faintest hint of moonlight filtering through the drapes and casting long shadows across the floor. The weight of the past few hours seemed to hang heavily on her, yet there was a subtle change in the air now, a sense of finality that couldn't be ignored. Holmes glanced toward the door as the soft sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway, growing nearer. Dr. Forsyth entered quietly, his steps hesitant, almost as if unsure whether to intrude on the quiet space. His usual composure was absent now, replaced by the weariness of a man who had witnessed the unraveling of everything he had helped construct. The weight of guilt hung about him, pressing down with every breath he took. "Mr. Holmes," Dr. Forsyth said softly, his voice almost apologetic as he stood just inside the doorway. I wanted to thank you for what you've done here." Holmes didn't immediately respond, his hands folded behind his back as he continued to study the scene before him. There was something almost sad in Forsyth's voice, a resigned acceptance that he could no longer hide from his involvement. The man had, after all, played his part in the deception that had plagued Lady Eleanor's family for so long. And now, there was nothing left to do but face the consequences. "You should not thank me, Doctor Forsyth," Holmes finally said, his tone steady but laced with a quiet reproach. "I did not do this for your benefit, nor for Blackwood's. This was never about gratitude. It was about uncovering the truth." Forsyth's eyes fell to the floor, and for a brief moment, the hardness in his expression seemed to soften. "You're right, of course," he murmured, his voice distant, as though speaking to himself more than to Holmes. "I've spent so long living in the shadows of others' deeds, believing that the lies would keep us safe. But I can see now that I was wrong." Holmes regarded him closely, his mind already turning over the implications of Forsyth's words. There was no innocence left in the doctor, not now. His actions had been driven by greed and fear, by the desire to maintain a facade of respectability while he worked in the background to ensure the family's secrets remained hidden. But now, all of that had collapsed, leaving him standing in the rubble of his own choices. "Do you understand the gravity of your actions, Doctor?" "Forsyth?" Holmes asked, his voice unwavering. "What you've done cannot be undone. But there are consequences, and you must face them. Whether that means speaking the truth to those who've been wronged, or accepting the penalties that come with your involvement, is for you to decide." The doctor nodded slowly, his expression unreadable, though there was something in his eyes that suggested a weight lifting, a quiet acknowledgement that the path ahead was one he would have to walk alone. Lady Eleanor, still seated by the window, turned her head slowly toward Forsyth. There was no malice in her gaze, only a deep sadness, as though she were mourning the man she had once trusted. "Doctor, Forsyth," she said softly, her voice quiet but carrying a certain strength now. "Your actions have cost us more than I think you realize. But I hope, for your sake, that you find some measure of redemption in what you've done. For your sake, and for the sake of all the lives that have been affected by this mess." Forsyth's shoulders sagged as he nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. "I understand," he said simply, his voice barely a whisper. "I can't undo what's been done, but I can try to make amends. I'll speak to the authorities. I'll tell them everything." Lady Eleanor turned away, her gaze returning to the window, her voice steady but tinged with the faintest hint of regret. "Do what you must. But know that for some things, no amount of atonement can undo the damage caused." Holmes gave her a moment to process, his thoughts turning toward the larger implications of the case. The coin had been recovered, the debts paid, but the scars remained. The relationships fractured, the trust broken. There were no easy fixes for such things. The family's legacy, built on centuries of history, had been tainted forever, and though justice had been served, there would be no return to the way things had been. "The truth is a powerful thing," Holmes remarked quietly, his voice almost distant. "But it is not always kind. It has a way of exposing the darkest corners of the soul, the parts we wish to hide away. And when it is revealed, there is no going back, only forward." He turned his attention back to Lady Eleanor, who had remained silent throughout the exchange. She was still facing the window, her expression distant, lost in thought. He could see the change in her, though. Her shoulders had relaxed, the tension that had once gripped her body now gone. She had made her peace, or at least, she was on the path to it. "Lady Eleanor," Holmes said, his voice softer now, "you must make your choice as well. This house, this estate, it's yours now. The legacy of your family is in your hands. What you do with it is yours to decide." She looked at him then, her gaze steady, though her eyes were shadowed by the weight of all that had transpired. "I don't know what comes next, Mr. Holmes," she said quietly, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "But I know I must face what I've done, and I will do my best to rebuild what's been broken." Holmes nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture of understanding. He had done his part. The rest was up to them now. He turned and moved toward the door, his coat rustling softly as he passed. He paused in the doorway, glancing back one last time at the remnants of the once strong house. There would be no easy answers for Lady Eleanor, no simple path forward. But at least the truth was out, and that, for better or worse, was a start. As he stepped into the quiet hallway, the door to the drawing room closing softly behind him, Holmes allowed himself a moment of reflection. The case was closed, but the ripple effects of the truth would be felt for a long time to come. The moonlight outside had grown brighter, casting its pale glow on the grounds as Holmes made his way toward the exit. The night was still, the air crisp and cool, and though the puzzle was solved, the world remained as mysterious as ever.